Hi, this is Mark Kramer, founder and managing director of FSG, and I'm excited to welcome you to today's webinar on creating shared value, making the case in your company. We have a terrific group of panelists this morning. Mark Fitzer from FSG's Geneva office, Paul Ellingstad from HP, Jessica Hubbard from Houghton Mifflin Harcourt, and Paul Schneider from Intercontinental Hotels Group. And they're going to talk about, from their own experiences in their companies, how they were able to make the case. Let me start off with just a word of introduction about FSG. We are about a 100-person nonprofit organization that provides strategy consulting, evaluation, and research to clients around the world. We were started in 2000 by Professor Porter and myself, originally as Foundation Strategy Group, but we now work across all sectors with corporations, foundations, governments, and NGOs to help organizations find better ways to solve social problems. And increasingly for us, that has meant working with companies on strategies to create shared value and to think about how to begin the journey within the company that leads to a shared value approach. Next slide, please. We're looking forward to a good conversation today, and we want to spend a good half of the time on question and answers from the audience. You can enter a question at any time by typing it into the question and answer box on the lower left. And I'm sure we will not be able to answer all of the questions that come in, but we will be able to certainly pick the ones that we think can make the most interesting conversations or reflect most broadly the comments we're hearing back. So we do look forward to hearing from you. I know that most of the people on the call are already familiar with the concept of creating shared value from the HBR article that Michael Porter and I wrote. And we really do want to concentrate today's call on the questions of how do you make the case. But I do want to just spend a minute or two at the outset recapping very briefly some of the ideas around creating shared value. Next slide. We've seen that the way companies think about engaging with society has changed dramatically over time. I think if you go back 10 or 20 years ago, the prevailing attitude of companies was that social issues are not our problem. We can ignore them unless pressure is put on us from external sources, and then we can respond by philanthropy, perhaps by public relations, but by and large we want to minimize our accountability and responsibility. That attitude now is ancient history. But I think as companies evolved, they have evolved through several stages. They began to think about it as a problem largely about their reputation. And then at some point they began to realize that these issues, the environmental issues, the workforce and supply chain issues, these issues were genuine problems that needed to be solved and that they needed to begin to report on transparently. But they still thought of these issues as problems, as constraints and limitations on their business, as cost centers more than as profit centers or opportunities. I think what is really different about the concept of creating shared value is that it is an opportunity for the company to improve its performance, to lower costs, to grow revenues, or to differentiate itself from competitors in the way that it addresses social issues. And this means that companies have begun to tackle social issues that are outside their footprint, to find that they can offer solutions to problems that they didn't cause and don't contribute to, but where they have key elements of the solution. In some ways, what we're seeing is businesses taking on constraints and limitations that they used to accept as a given. The lack of access to certain low-income markets, the lack of a trained employee base, the lack of environmentally friendly solutions to particular issues. And now to tackle these and say, we don't have to take these things as given. We can solve these problems, and in doing so, we create shared value. Next slide, please. So shared value really occupies a space, an overlapping space, between creating social value, investments that address social and environmental objectives, and creating business value, investments that improve profitability and long-term competitiveness. It can be confusing to think about both of these dimensions at the same time. We come out of a world where we are so used to thinking of social problems as being dealt with by government and civil society, and the corporation's role there is to be philanthropic, and business initiatives which are all about making money and which don't factor in the social and environmental consequences of what they do. It is a different way of thinking for a company to think about how to optimize both of these dimensions at the same time. But we are increasingly seeing companies around the world, leading companies, GE, Walmart, the folks who are on our panel today, seeing that there is opportunity to grow and expand and improve their business by looking at both of these dimensions at the same time. When we think about the way companies actually create shared value, we think about three basic ways of doing it: reconceiving products and markets, redefining the activities in their value chain, and strengthening their local clusters. Every company, we believe, faces opportunities to create shared value through all three of these different ways. But the kinds of initiatives that are developed look quite different among these three ways. We've encountered lots of examples, lots of companies that have approached us since the article came out, describing and listing different initiatives that they've created in these three categories. I'm not going to try and give examples today. We'll certainly hear them from the panel, and you'll certainly find other resources on the website of fsg.org. But the real topic we want to focus on today is not the theory of creating shared value, but how to make the case in your company. What is the journey that a company needs to go on to transform itself from a conventional company into a shared value company? And for that, I'd like to introduce Mark Fitzer, Managing Director in FSG's Geneva office, to talk to us about what we have seen in working with companies today. Mark?
Great. Thank you, Mark. And next slide, please. Hi, everybody. It's really great to have you all on this webinar today. As a context, I'd like to go back to a meeting we had in June in Cambridge, US, when we convened about 60 global companies at a leadership summit on creating shared value, or CSV as we've been calling it, and I will use during this webinar for short. And top of mind at that meeting for many was really no longer the potential of the concept. It was really around this critical question that Mark just mentioned of the how do you get companies, how do you get my company, how do I get my company moving on this CSV agenda? How do I begin to implement? How do I measure shared value creation? And thanks to the support of HB, and it's great we'll hear from Paul today from HB, we could discuss our first answers around the 10 building blocks you see on this slide. At top, and we can't emphasize this more, CSV is driven by senior leadership. We really get its significance for the long-term resilience and growth of their company. CSV is CEO and board driven because it goes to the heart of a company's purpose and future potential. When companies like Nestle shift from being food companies to being nutrition and health companies, when car companies define their mission around mobility, or seed companies around food security, it has to come from the top. But champions in the business make it happen too. And you see this around the next level of strategy. And really about champions helping and working to pinpoint those few social issues that provide the greatest opportunity for shared value creation. Corporate-wide, sometimes, business unit level-wise, product category levels, depending on how social issues interact with the specific business models they're facing. I don't have time to go into the detail now, but there really are essential steps here in screening the social issues that are most connected with business success and can be the focus for innovation. And the big point about the ambitious goals, that's the next box on this level, is that you have to be intentional about it. You have to define a priori how a specific investment stream is going to deliver both economic and social value. Social value, by the way, meaning a specific change against a targeted issue. And the key difference between sort of the generic win-win thinking that we've seen a lot around business and society and creating shared value is the specificity and intentionality on economic and social change. When a Jain irrigation company in India, for example, sells a new drip irrigation system, of course it's tracking revenue and it's tracking profits of sales, but it's also targeting how much water savings it's achieving in agriculture. When a Novo Nordisk educates doctors and patients on diabetes in China, it creates this much health outcomes, cost reductions in health system, and of course X sales for Novo. So with intentionality, you can do what's at the bottom of our building blocks here, is you can track whether you're getting the anticipated returns that you expected on shared value returns. You can learn from it, and you can increase the value creation. But I jumped over the delivery blocks, the yellow part here, and they're worth, of course, much, much more discussion. Let me just focus here on the last one, which is critical, which is working with partners outside the company. That's not new. But with shared value, what's new is that these partners buy into the shared value proposition. They work with the company to make profits and to achieve the social impact they think of themselves, to achieve social impact. And they think of themselves as assets in creating shared value, because they know how to drive down costs or to change distribution models, as we discussed during our last webinar with Novartis and the Arogya Parivar example. And that takes a new attitude and new types of organizations as partners, and therefore also a different perspective, a different approach from the business in terms of what it is about the partner to create shared value. Next slide, please. So here are some additional lessons we're picking up, and we hear a lot more from our participants. The first I alluded to already, it's around leadership. What's key about creating shared value rather than its CSR legacy is that it's driven from the inside out and from the top down. It's because it's about a company's mission. It's about its purpose. It's about enhancing its competitive advantage. And that can't be dictated from the outside. It's just deeply informed by the outside. But execution is very business unit, category, or geography specific depending on the company's business. And that means ownership and business planning has to quickly disseminate within the company, which gets us to the second column here, which is it takes time. This is not a quick fix. This is about turning ships around. It's about, as Mark mentioned, a journey. And we'll hear from our team today about this. It means changing business principles. It means talking a lot. It means tracking examples of shared value creation in the company to trigger more action. It means partnering with a decade's horizon, not just a year or two. And yes, third column, it's about change management, more than project management. But it doesn't mean moving away from understanding the social issues you are targeting. Quite on the contrary, actually, shared value means understanding everything about these issues and being accountable for results, for creating that specific anticipated shared value. And that's new territory for many in business. Okay, but that's enough from FSG, and I think it's time to hear from our champions. And our first speaker today is Paul Eddingstad from HP. And Paul, I'll let you introduce yourself.
Great, thank you, Mark, and good morning and good afternoon to everyone. I just want to take a few minutes to share some of the highlights and the insights on the journey HP has been taking around creating shared value. First, for those of you who maybe don't know as much about HP, Bill and Dave founded the company in 1939, and the broad ethos of creating shared value is something that Bill and Dave instilled in all of the employees in the company from the very early stages. In fact, not long after the founding of the company, when employees had been asking Bill and Dave about the purpose of the company, they had said very clearly that the purpose is not simply to return shareholder value, but also to focus on social contribution. So this is something that's been well ingrained into the ethos of the company from the very early stages. Coming up to sort of modern times, though, we recognize that having the vision is important, but equally important is how we execute against that. And what we realized that our current journey in terms of implementing CSV really goes back to about 2 years ago, when, based on feedback from the board of looking at the financial performance of the company and then also the operational performance, while things were going quite well there was a feeling that in terms of social responsibility, there wasn't the same leadership, there wasn't the same commitment that we had seen previously in years past. And so that instigation from the board really drove an interest in looking at the new models, driving from what had sort of become more of a philanthropy model, more of a transaction model, to this new thinking around CSV. And based on that, we started a transformation process really looking at that vision and what we wanted to achieve. And what we had realized is that while there was significant focus on the cash, the financial, the technology giving, we hadn't really engaged all of the employees, the 320,000 employees worldwide, that really brought the enthusiasm, the passion, the expertise that could really drive transformational change. And so really that's been the focus, is how we engage the employees as well as all of these other assets of the company. And now 2 years on, I feel that we've done a very good job in laying out the vision, the strategy, and we're delivering on that, but now also focusing on the performance. Go to the next slide, please. So in terms of that process, just a couple of the highlights that we've seen. In terms of the vision itself, one of the key learnings that we saw was that having a small group define the vision is not really a very collaborative approach, and in terms of getting the buy-in not only from the board and the senior leadership, but also from employees, it's quite important to have a consultative process and to engage all levels of the organization, as well as our partners, our customers, and the beneficiaries of the programs that we want to drive in setting both the vision as well as the strategy. As an example here, I would sort of argue that of 320,000 employees, there are probably 320,000 different opinions and views on what we should be focusing on and why, and how we should go about defining solutions. What we found in going through this is that we have to set very clear choices, and we did that using both the Millennium Development Goals as a framework for prioritizing the social impact, but then also looking at our corporate strategy in terms of defining the business impacts that we would have as well. As we went into strategy then, again here, it's really down to making tough choices. There are so many different areas that we could focus on. And again here, we really leaned on the prioritization of the Millennium Development Goals, as well as then the business strategy, and having that buy-in in that prioritization set with the business leaders in the company as well. As we went into delivery, another key component for us is recognizing the importance of the ecosystem. That while HP has many capabilities and much expertise, it's really working within an ecosystem and ensuring that we know our role, our responsibilities, that we clarify that with other players in the ecosystem to make the most effective and sustainable contribution to long-term progress on some of these intractable challenges and problems. And as part of that, also engaging our business partners both within and outside of the company as well. As we go into the performance area, this is really our core focus right now as we've gone into implementation, is ensuring that we're measuring the right components both in terms of operational performance as well as outcomes and long-term results as well. And again, this is both something that we're looking at in terms of working with other organizations such as FSG to really define the most effective way of measuring, but also doing so in a very efficient manner as well. Next slide. So lastly, a couple of the key takeaways that I would share in terms of our learning over the course of the last 2 years, and as we now go into the third year of our CSV implementation. Innovation and coming up with creative solutions to some of these intractable problems and challenges that we see really does take a process. Just as CSV implementation itself is a process, innovation and partnering with individuals within the ecosystem needs to be managed in a very methodical, rigorous way if we're indeed going to deliver sustainable progress on these challenges. Secondly is that the ecosystem itself indeed does matter. As we found, as one example, working with Clinton Health Access Initiative and the Ministry of Health and other partners in Kenya to fundamentally transform how the ministry delivers health care and how we achieve better results for infant mortality isn't something that HP can do alone or even with a single partner. It's something that, that we make a contribution, we work with these other stakeholders, know our place, and work with them to deliver these results. And thirdly is both in terms of planning as well as even setting the vision, being very transparent in terms of your intentions, what you're looking to achieve, how you're looking to achieve it, as well as then the actual results and the performance is very, very critical to be as transparent with yourself, within your organization, with your partners, and ultimately with your beneficiaries as well. So we'll come back in the Q&A to follow up on some of these, but at a high level, these are the key learnings that we've taken from the last 2 years in implementing CSV.
Super. Thanks, Paul. I loved your point about the rigor of process, and we've certainly seen companies do that and really look at how social issues defined by MDGs or other ways of sort of looking at sort of the global challenges, how they intersect with your business model, with your business strategy, and at that point of intersection to generate these ideas for shared value. And it's a tremendously exciting process. We heard a little bit at our last webinar from Dow how they did that and how they generated sort of 40 ideas that crystallized into 3 major areas of growth for them. So that, I think, finds a lot of echo in our experience. I'd love to turn over the webinar now to Jessica Hubbard from HMH. And Jessica, tell us a little bit about you and about your work on shared value at HMH.
Terrific. Thank you so much for having me. Houghton Mifflin Harcourt is an education company. It's probably most familiar to those of you who recognize the name as a publisher, both a trade publisher, historically publishing Curious George, Martha Speaks, a number of children and adult titles for the past 200 years, as well as a textbook publisher, K-12, across all the sort of core subject areas. As you can imagine, the company's transformed significantly in the past number of years, and we really are offering a range of educational products and services and really thinking of ourselves less of a products company and more of an educational solutions provider. We are very early in our CSV journey. We started working with FSG on our strategy in 2010 and early 2010. Prior to that period of time, we obviously had a history of being philanthropic, but there was no strategy, there was no centralized department, no centralized decision-making, no overarching business or social goals. So we were starting basically from bucket 1 on the evolution of CSV slide that we saw earlier in this presentation. Working with FSG, we crystallized our strategy over the course of last year and created a CSR. The department itself is called Corporate Social Responsibility Department, but we're certainly employing CSV strategies that's designed to deliver on the following CSV value proposition. We think that HMH is in the business of selling educational achievement, and by maximizing the educational value of our products and services, we drive both social impact and business success. So that's what we're seeking to achieve throughout our CSV activities. Moving on to the next slide. We can look at some of the major learnings that we've had throughout this process, and specifically looking at how we've sought to build buy-in across the company in order to engage people company-wide in this value proposition, because it's certainly not something that we can carry out on our own. First, we've sought to engage senior leaders at various points in the development and implementation of our CSV strategy. During the strategy phase, we did interviewed something like 34 VPs and SVPs and C-suite officials, really focusing in on interviewing them to understand what their strategies are, what their needs are, so that we can identify the key issues that could benefit from a CSV approach, so we could really understand where we could add value that would have both a social impact and a business impact. During the program design phase, which is what we've been working on for about the past year, we've been working closely with business unit heads in particular to understand first, ensure that the programs that we're designing together are designed to truly meet their needs. Second, to ensure that the way we plan to execute the programs are a fit with their business structure and activities, That's something that I probably undervalued coming into that process, but I've recognized as being really key to seeing success. And 3, to ensure that the teams of the business units that we're collaborating with are as involved as possible in executing the CSV programs. Throughout this process, I think we've done a good job of working to understand the business issues that we're trying to address and helping our company understand how we can collaborate with them. But I don't think that we've yet done a good job of teaching our leadership that CSV is something that they can and should embrace, that it's something that they should be thinking about in their business activities and getting them to really take on ownership of the CSV programs that we're building together. So that's still a work in progress for us, and it's something I really recommend you think about early in this kind of work, because it's an absolutely critical piece of actually creating shared value as opposed to creating CSR programs that are sort of a nice fit around the edges of the company. As we engage with senior leaders throughout the company, we've really sought to relate to them in many ways as our clients. I think one thing that's been really important to that is that we have a very senior leader running our CSR group. It didn't really start out that way. The job was scoped initially at a director level, that evolved to be a VP, and then in the hiring process, once they identified the right candidate, he was at a level that they made him an SVP. And that's made it just so much easier for him to develop one-on-one, really peer relationships with the business unit leaders that we need to collaborate with in order to be successful as a driver of CSV within the company. It's helped us to understand their businesses more thoroughly and also to really become a trusted partner. We also have a member of our group whose job is entirely to work with one of our key business unit partners to bring the tools of CSV to bear on their activities, which basically means that he's doing business development for CSV, for the idea of CSV within the company, and growing our footprint by working with that group to identify opportunities for us to collaborate. In explaining our value proposition to our business unit partners, we've been most successful when we focus in on the business value as opposed to the social value of these activities. I think a lot of people are still under the misguided impression that creating social value detracts from creating business value. And in the long term, it's really going to be important for us to address that idea if we're really going to truly embed shared value in the company, and not just our group, but in the company's way of doing business. But in the short term, it's in order to convince these business units to use their very limited time and resources on a new strategy, something that is untested in their eyes. We really need to focus on how this addresses the problems they're trying to solve, on how this will help them do better against the metrics on which they are judged, not on which we are judged, and those are still primarily business metrics. We've found it much easier to position ourselves as a service organization through tactical initiatives rather than strategic initiatives. So, for instance, we can also often help with an introduction, help draw media attention to an activity, help create a shared meaning between one of our business units and a prospective customer. And that's all great. It adds value, but it's not really creating shared value. But I think that's an appropriate interim step for a company that's very new to CSV. Because we've seen that these small, lower-impact activities are helping to position this very brand-new group within the company and helping us to build the relationships we need to really create shared value successfully. Most of all, we've learned that building buy-in is absolutely an iterative process. We've had 3 CEOs this calendar year. It's not as bad as it sounds. That includes an intern for 6 months, and we've just brought in a new CEO. But that really made us realize that for turnover reasons alone, you can't assume that your job is ever done in bringing senior leadership on board. We've also found that business unit heads are more and less engaged based on what else is going on in their business. Someone who is totally bought in one day might be really skeptical of the next because of other things going on in the competitive context. So I think that the solution to that is probably really selling the underlying value of the CSV strategy as opposed to the value of the individual CSV initiatives. But that's really hard because it's hard to get time on someone's calendar to have what might feel like an academic discussion of a new business strategy as opposed to discuss a concrete initiative that might add value to their business. But I think that's where we're going to need to go next to really get this embedded in the company as opposed to just being an advocate of it within our group. So we are beginning to think about what that means and how we can go about doing that. Moving to the next slide, I've covered most of the tips on this slide in discussing our experience, so I'll just highlight a few. Point 5, focusing on under-resourced business units. What I mean here is that we found that business units that don't have sufficient support in areas where we can add value, like R&D, like marketing, relationship development, business development, are really eager to work with us. And not just eager to work with us, but they embed us in their work. They're not trying to say, how can you advise us? They're saying, get in here with us, get down and dirty with us, and work with us, be part of our group. And that's really phenomenal. Point 7, I think we've had the perspective that we'll start telling our story within the company when the strategy is fully in place. but we found that celebrating success is really key to building buy-in. So to helping people understand what we're about and what we're doing here. So I think it's really important to celebrate the small landmarks along the way. And for the same reason, to go after quick wins so that you can tell those stories and educate the company about CSV. So this is very much a work in progress for us. We still feel like we're really new at this, but we're learning as fast as we can. We're growing very quickly, and we see really enormous potential, as well as emerging results in the idea of creating shared value for our company.
Thank you, Jessica. Fantastic. We've discussed this before. I just love the notion of a publishing company redefining its purpose around educational outcomes. There's just so much power in that, and as you described it, of course, it then begins to engage business units and activities in a completely different way in terms of, what the mission and purpose and how to reshape activities to deliver on that, and that's great. And your notion on celebrating success, I think we see that a lot as well. Use the small wins, communicate those to give as examples to business units in other parts of the world, the guidance on what the company is looking for. So great stuff. All right, last but not least contributor, Paul Schneider from IHG. Paul, all yours.
Thanks very much, and good morning and good afternoon, everyone. I am Paul Schneider. I'm Vice President of Corporate Responsibility for Intercontinental Hotels Group. Our company is a portfolio of 7 hotel brands: Intercontinental, Crowne Plaza, Hotel Indigo, Holiday Inn Express, Staybridge Suites, and Candlewood Suites. We've got a little over 4,400 hotels across the globe. And the interesting thing for us is that 3,800 of those are franchises, meaning we are primarily a franchisor, lending our trademarks, our marketing strength to small business owners, and so it's their business, and that creates some interesting challenges and actually some interesting opportunities to demonstrate the actual efficacy of CSV. But let me start real quickly with the journey that we've been on. Our Senior Vice President for Corporate Responsibility, David Jerome, when he joined the company in 2006, immediately started talking about the CR mission in terms of a CSV frame. And he started those discussions primarily at the top. And so as you've heard and a couple times here, you can't do it without the top. And David's persistence, along with the teams, in talking about how our CR mission is not a zero-sum mission between our business priorities and our societal responsibilities, is one that ultimately carried the day to the point where we actually have got a subcommittee of our board that is our CR subcommittee, which is an awfully nice thing to have. That would be something I would encourage anyone to try and have happen, because it gives you an awful lot of air cover and focus when you're trying to make these arguments penetrate silos and actually move the ball down the field. But really, in a lot of ways, it hasn't even so much been about sort of injecting the CSV frame. In a lot of ways, in our company, it was already there. It was revealing the fact that a lot of our general managers at our hotels or our department supervisors at our units, in a lot of ways, already were thinking in a lot of ways about CSV. They just didn't realize it. They were thinking about the fact that as a hotel, they're a member of a community, and that being a good member of that community is good business. And so a lot of it has been essentially placing this frame around a lot of activity that's already happened. That doesn't mean to say that there isn't some places where we need to actually make the activity itself happen. We manifestly do, and I'll get to that in a second. But as you see, as I mentioned on the slide, different stakeholders at different levels of maturity. So we've had some that are doing this, some that are aware of the frame, and some that still require some education. And as some of the other folks have talked about before, it has been about very much thinking about their business, their priorities, and their metrics, and talking about how the CSV approach can actually help them achieve their aims and the things that they're being measured against. And the things that we constantly return to with our push and messaging around creating shared value is that our societal needs, our employee needs, our guest needs, and our financial requirements are not mutually exclusive and are not zero-sum. In fact, them being independent and mutually empowering means that sometimes your best financial returns are around efforts that have this CSV frame or a societal frame around it. We talk about things like 1 + 1 = 3. There are all sorts of different sort of metaphors you can use. But we've been very successful internally at the company in several venues in making the case that your best financial performance, that obviously is the most discrete measurement that we have, can be achieved a lot of times by thinking about things within a CSV frame. Can we go to the next slide, please? Thank you. So as someone spoke to earlier, you just have got to have the top bought in, not just agreeing with you, but messaging and using a lot of the same language that fits and is resonant with a CSV frame. So it's not just about the tactical elements of them actually allocating resources or providing air cover, as we mentioned there, but it's also just about the reinforcement, because those folks have got the attention. Your senior leaders have the attention of the broad-based stakeholders within your company and outside your company, and so the more that they're speaking within a CSV frame, whether they're calling it out specifically CSV or in other ways, it just reinforces your message and gives you a greater sort of platform to drive some of these efforts through your organization. But one thing that we have found, in some respects to our surprise, is the rank and file, and here we're talking about our employees in our hotels and our guests, in a lot of ways already have a CSV orientation. And what we mean by that is, if you think about some of our guests who want to stay at a hotel, but they want to stay at a hotel that makes them feel good with regard to sustainability. Or if you think about an employee who wants to work in the hotel business, but it matters to them what our sustainability posture is, what our community posture is, what our societal impact for good is. These are questions that we've been getting for years, discreetly from our guests, from our employees, without, again, them sort of talking about it in terms of CSV. But as we started to think about it, we realized that our most powerful partners in a lot of ways are the rank and file, because as you're making your case internally at a company, it is not often that you're going to lose if you can point to some discrete research, be it customer research or employee research, that says this stuff matters to the people that really matter the most to you, the people that actually spend money on your product and the people that deliver that product to the people that are actually purchasing. So in some ways, we think about it as an inverse normal distribution. A lot of times we've found that we've got nice high buy-in and adoption and resonance at the top in senior leadership, and nice high buy-in and resonance down with the rank and file, and it's the middle that is really our challenge. The folks that are really under the most stress to deliver on financial targets, they are the most siloed. They are the ones that it's a lot of times the toughest to sort of pull them out of their present frame and make them realize that within a CSV frame, they're actually going to deliver even better on the things that they're discretely measured against. The other thing that we're mentioning there, aside from activating middle management, is the rank and file have got antennae around authenticity that is profound and scary. And particularly amongst the rank and file with guests and employees, if you are trying to talk about your societal impact for good and how that can have resonance with your financial objectives, if you're not authentic about that, they will know it almost immediately. And so that just forces you to take a couple steps back. So we think a lot about whether we're fronting up what we're trying to do as an enterprise, both within the financial sector or within society. We think about how are we authentically speaking about this even better. Can we get someone else to speak about what we're doing rather than us, because that's even more authentic. So those are two challenges we have as we navigate some of this stuff. If we could go to the next slide, please. The last thing I'm going to quickly talk about today is something that's very, very tactical. We have an environmental management and remediation platform that's web-based that we have created for our hotels. We call it Green Engage. We're on our second version of it, and the way that I explain it is it's sort of like a scale, meaning it gets to take your weight, and it's also an exercise program, which means it gives you a way to actually get yourself more in shape from a sustainability perspective. We've got a great platform. We've had great adoption on it, but we're looking actually to double our subscriptions. And remember, I said before, we're in a franchise environment. We can't actually order, unless we pass a brand standard, we can't order one of our franchisees to use our platform. We have to convince them to use our platform. And the argument that we're putting there is very much a CSV framework. We are right now out in the field looking to double our subscriptions with enrollment kits with a lot of our field-based personnel that are talking about sort of the circumspect element of making a CSV argument. Realizing two things. With some franchisees, it's going to be the weight of the CSV argument and all of its elements that actually carry the day. And with others, we're doing it because they only need one reason to purchase. And if that one reason to purchase is to lower their costs, then fine. They get the other stuff as a bonus in their mind. If their one reason to purchase is to generate better top-line revenue, then fine. But when we're in our industry in particular, in a disaggregated, geographically dispersed units all across the globe, we can't make a custom argument to every individual owner. And so the CSV frame allows us to make a very circumspect argument, letting the owner hang their hat on the things that are most important to them. So then what that means for us is that we have to understand that when we're making a CSV argument, when we're pushing that out, that it's not about sort of equality across all the different things that are involved within a CSV framework. Different individuals will have different weights in terms of what's important to them. And that's okay. It's okay if their primary weight is financial and they're just sort of getting the sustainability side. You see the quote there, and that's a direct quote from a CEO of a portfolio of hotel companies. So that's something very tactically that we're doing with the CSV frame in our franchised and, again, geographically dispersed business is really helping a lot. We're getting great adoption with our uptake in terms of going onto Green Engage, and I'm not sure that we would have been as successful if we hadn't had sort of CSV as part of our thinking and really the way that we're making the case out there. So thanks very much for your time and attention today.
Paul, thank you. And thank you for putting such emphasis on the question of adoption. And we've received many, dozens of questions, and we've had several around. And by the way, please, everybody, keep sending your questions. We've got several questions around this challenge of building momentum, of overcoming the internal challenge of the concept, of overcoming sort of the business is good for society in any case. Well, what's different about this? I'd love to hear from Jessica, because you alluded to that as well. How are you overcoming the challenge from business units? What examples do you use to make the case? What argumentation? How do you paint the nature of the prize, which goes to the quote that Paul just described?
Sure, absolutely. I think that we have the advantage of being an education company, so people understand the idea that if we can produce better educational outcomes than our competitors and we can demonstrate that those outcomes are superior, then we win. So I think the fact starting with the people who have a baseline understanding of that has been very helpful, but that doesn't make it easy by any stretch. So some of the hurdles that we faced have been certainly resource constraints. Sometimes that makes it easier for us because it means that we can supplement the business unit's resources. So that's been a great strategy for us. In other cases, it's the attention that's the key, that's the constrained resource. And in that case, it can make it very difficult. But I think having really dedicated relationship management strategies, the group that we've been most successful in collaborating with is a group where we have someone assigned, his entire job is to bring CSV to that group. The parallel group, where we've had more of a challenge, has been a group where our relationship is much more scattered. We report back to them on our evolving thinking and our updated recommendations, and we've been less successful in integrating them in the planning process.
Great. Okay, well, looking at the questions, we've got a lot of them covering our building blocks in different ways. We've got a lot of questions around the partners for creating shared value. So looking at the outside, and what's the role of government? What's the role of NGO partners? What are the best types of partners that can work with companies to achieve shared value on a new scale? And how do you go about selecting those? Paul Ellingstadt from HP, would you like to take that one?
Sure, I'd love to touch on that, Mark. Just one quick follow-up from Jessica on the leadership. I would just add one real quick comment there that, fundamentally implementing CSV is a change management process. And, taking a page out of Chip and Dan Heath's book, Switch, on change management, I would say rather than focus strictly on the, on the hierarchy on your leadership, also look at the bright spots. And that's something that we've been very successful at is finding, those who get it and embrace it and want to be a part of it, as well as on, just the conventional leadership as well. And that's made a big difference. In terms of the collaboration with partners, I guess it's something fundamental to HP's strategy, not just in terms of CSV, but our overall go-to-market strategy, our corporate strategy. That we recognize that we have talent and expertise, but while it's more complex, while it may take longer to get a consortia of partners working together, in the long run, that's going to be a much more sustainable approach. And so what we have done in implementing CSV, rather than just looking at sort of projects or specific issues that we want to address, we give equal importance to looking at the partnerships that we want to form. And quite critical in that is not only looking at the expertise, but the same issue of do partners get it? Do they see the value of focusing both on business value and on the social value? And that has really we lead with those partnerships, and through the results that we're able to achieve. Number one, we're able to achieve results much faster because we're accelerating through this this common purpose and common philosophy. But then the results that we are achieving is sort of it's leading by example and creating the proof points that are generating buy-in for new partners and new stakeholders that we want to bring into the collaboration as well.
That's great. It's clear that shared value is redefining the game inside companies, but it is also redefining how other sectors can engage with business. And so I think the transformation is really going to spread much beyond the companies here. Paul and Jessica, would you like to build on the partnering and selection process identification question as well?
Sure. We're still relatively early in our process. We're in the earlier stages of developing partnerships, so we don't have any completed that are good examples. But what we found in the sort of screening stage is that it can sometimes be uncomfortable to be really upfront that this is a business initiative. That surprised me going into those meetings. I'm very comfortable with that idea. That's why I'm interested in this kind of work, is the synergies. But I still found sitting across the table from a nonprofit, it was oftentimes felt uncomfortable to say this is a business initiative for us and it's important that it delivers business value. But I think the first thing is that it's critically important to lay that on the table so the nonprofit understands what you're trying to achieve. And secondly, I was really surprised that the nonprofits that were otherwise the best partners for us were also the ones that most understood that and were totally comfortable with that and had no philosophical disagreement and had total practical agreement as well.
Great. Paul, want to add to that? Or?
Sure. I mean, what's been interesting to us as we've been sort of pushing this frame external to the company is I agree with what Jessica says that your best nonprofit partners already get it, but some of the middling ones, it's been interesting. They're still in very much a zero-sum philanthropic frame. And so there have been some interesting conversations where we're like, no, we want to do something and partner with you on an effort, but there's a genuine and core and foundational business element to this. And so in some respects, it hasn't just been about educating internally. There's been some education actually externally as well that we've had to do.
Great. Well, we've got a whole bundle of questions around the big one. Certainly we call it the big one, which is the shared value measurement and how the concept, the opportunities, and acting on them is redefining or / potentially redefining how business planning is done, how assessing investments is done, and how ultimately once understanding is created on shared value, how that information is reported externally. So we'd love to touch on this measurement insights. Where are you in that process? What's happening? Paul Schneider, maybe you can build on that.
Sure. I think at our company we're still in very early days. Our approach right now, and this is sort of to help us get into the walls and into some of the silos, is to use other people's metrics so that, whatever metrics different business units are using to measure their own performance, we then put that into a frame, or we align our frame to that, so that, again, we go back to that sort of core value proposition, which is, what we're discussing here with CSV is going to help you not only achieve your targets, but actually in some cases exceed them. However, we do have one thing broad-based across the company. Like most companies, we use a balanced scorecard, or we call ours a wheel, and it's in 4 different sections. There's financial returns, there's guest experience, employee engagement, and then the 4th wedge is responsible business. And so we've successfully, again, the board committee helped us a lot with this, successfully made that element, sort of like that last leg of the stool from a CSV standpoint, part of the overall measurement of the company. And there's nothing like the attention and the focus that's given when every single person in the company has got to fill out elements of their annual KPOs within each of those 4 buckets. That's something that, and just having that measurement right there is something that has helped us a lot, because we have partners and colleagues within the company that come to us and say, I've got to fill out something for responsible business. What do I do? And so that's been enormously helpful for us in gaining us entree to having some really productive discussions with different teams.
Great. Paul, do you want to build on that, on metrics? And perhaps we've got questions also on how that relates to incentives in more detail. Paul Ellingstad, is this something you want to cover?
Sure. So, I think it goes back to transparency, that, behavior is driven largely by what's measured. And, quite frankly, in terms of where we're at, I touched on it on the overview, we're still building out our performance dashboard. We've got a high-level dashboard, and we're tracking in terms of, social impact, both, operationally as well as, the longer-term outcomes. For instance, the rollout of programs or the execution of programs, but then the example that I had given with infant HIV analysis and testing, we're ultimately looking long-term at what impact that's going to have on infant mortality rates as well. You also need to look at business metrics around corporate reputation, revenue growth, employee engagement. With the same program, as an example in Kenya, we had very little business engagement with the government, and specifically with the Ministry of Health before we had started our program. Now, as a consequence of building the relationship, reframing the perception, we were seen as a printer company, as a hardware supplier, prior to the engagement and building up this relationship and this partnership. And now we're seen as a completely different type of partner, and and it's creating business opportunities as a consequence. So you really do need to look at what your business partners, what their metrics are, how they're measured, your NGO partners as well, and build out this dashboard. Be very transparent in terms of what your goals are, how you're measuring. Many times, what you're trying to measure, there might not even be data that already exists. But, you need to look for proxies in that as well. So it really drives the accountability, both in terms of social impact as well as your business impact as well.
Great. Jessica, would you like to comment on how far you guys are getting on?
Sure, absolutely. I would consider us to be in the very early stages of this. We are sort of in the stage of counting things and collecting stories. I think that's important to building buy-in, but it doesn't help us to measure success. We are in the process of building a dashboard as well, but that dashboard that is currently on the table is focused more on measuring the impacts of some of our more tactical exercises. So there's still a lot of room to go on the bigger picture strategic elements of both social and business impact. That said, one of the pillars of our CSR initiative, of our CSV initiative, is research and evaluation. The idea there being that since we are an educational products company, the biggest way that we can drive social impact is to ensure that the products and services the company delivers are delivering the most educational valuable possible. So what we're looking to do is to help the company really push itself as far as it can go in terms of its own research and evaluation capabilities and using that information as a feedback loop to improve the product over time. And so in that case, it's really an issue of embedding the measurement in the business itself. That's not something that our group would ever carry out. That's a core business activity, but it's something that we can help the company think about in a different way so that we're driving both social and business impact.
That's great, the focus. And there's two elements here that, I think that one is, the difficulty and challenge of actually measuring the outcomes effectively and having to boost your capabilities to do that. And then, of course, the process of doing that, you realize, of course, that, the level of attribution to your action, of course, is only limited. Educational outcomes also depend on a lot of other things. So love to have more discussion on that, but I think we'll probably move on to the other questions. But the questions, of course, of the complexity of measurement in the social sector now is aligned with the complexity of economic and financial measurement, and we need to tackle that. We've got a bundle of questions around the role of how can you sort of overcome the challenges, maybe changes in leadership, which actually some of our companies here have experienced, how you overcome that with a solid culture around shared value, a solid agenda. Does somebody want to talk to how you create something that here can then sustain sort of short-term changes in the company like that?
This is Jessica. I'm happy to jump in since, as I mentioned, we have our third CEO of the year right now. Our previous CEO left in January. We had an interim for 6 months, and a new one started 2 weeks ago. Because that's so new, we'll see. Ask me this question again in a few months, and I'm sure I'll have a more thorough answer for you. But I think that what we are really focusing on is twofold. One is communicating directly as possible to our senior leaders as early as possible and as often as possible, really focusing in on the business case over and above the social case at this stage of the game. But then at the same time, we're focusing on a more rank-and-file strategy. So we are currently piloting the development of CSR committees in 3 of our offices. We're hopeful, based on the early results of those pilots, that we'll expand that program company-wide. And we're trying to not only have those people manage some of the traditional sort of corporate philanthropy activities, like local grant making and planning local volunteer activities, but really making them ambassadors for the concept of CSV so that they're spreading that idea throughout the company. So I'm hoping that in addition to coming from the top and going directly to those critical senior leaders, that will also create a situation in which it's bubbling up, not just from the 7 of us in our group, but from throughout the company.
Wonderful. Thank you. Well, let's conclude. We, of course, have loads more questions, but hopefully that's just an opening for more webinars. And I'd just like to come back to the reality of shared value as a journey, as we have all mentioned. And we know that there are many stages, from creating interest for the concept, curiosity in the ideas, which happens through discussions, workshops, to building the excitement for a specific vision around shared value in the company, to really pinpointing those priorities for investments, to beginning to roll out these investments and to have that value creation process happen, have impact for the company, have impact on the social issues, and use that as a Trojan horse to continue disseminating the opportunity within the company. And we know that there's as many nuances of this out there as there are companies. Some it will be driven very centrally, top down. Some is guided much more adaptively, in a much more adaptive way. The corporation, the center, is providing sort of tension to perform on shared value, but is leaving a lot of the doing to the business units or to the categories or whichever way is appropriate to each company. But I think there'll be a common point here, and I'll leave that as a food for thought. I think as businesses embrace shared value, the question to business is really going to shift from, what impact are you having on society to, what portion of your profits or value creation is associated or caused by your focus on social issues. And that's going to be fundamental, because that's going to change. It's going to mean that, change is going to reach into the core business planning processes. Investing is going to have to anticipate both economic and social outcomes, and it will change the face of both internal and external reporting. So on the way there, we'll hope to provide even better guidance as we learn more from companies and from our participants today, which I thank very much. And if you want more details on the 10 building blocks, they are on our website in a report that's called Creating Shared Value, a how-to guide for the new corporate revolution. Thank you to all of you for attending. Thank you, Paul and Jessica. Good luck in creating shared value.